Well, good to see you all again. It is great that we can keep in touch through these tricky times, isn't it? And today I want to look at the second of the third most famous of the resurrection appearances of Jesus Christ. The resurrection is so important to us as Christians. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, if there's no resurrection, there's no point. No resurrection, there's no faith. And the whole of the Christian church didn't invent the idea of the resurrection. The resurrection and the experiences that we're looking at, they're the things that created the church. The church grew out of those experiences, those first-hand, passionate memories that have been faithfully recorded for us. And that's what we're going to look at today, the second of the three big ones. The first one, of course, is the road to Emmaus, where we looked at the disappointment that those two men had with Jesus, and yet how that transformed. The disappointment with God transformed when they met the risen Jesus Christ. And that's still true today, that when we have an experience, a moment when we look, think, engage with him and meet him somehow, internally, externally, when we have an experience of him, then our disappointment with God and with life evaporates. It radically changes our view of life. And the second one is the story of Thomas. Now, poor old Thomas, he needs a better PR team, doesn't he? Imagine being known as Doubting Thomas forever. And he does need a better campaign, really, to rescue his reputation. Well, we'll look at that. We'll look at that together. In some ways, I think Doubting Thomas isn't really right. I also think it's quite generous to him in some ways. The word doubting really has stuck with him. It's moved beyond the Christian world into a far wider experience as well. Don't be a doubting Thomas is a phrase that is used in far more than just the Christian world. But actually, it's a title that came much later in Christian understanding. If you look at the early translations, and I say not the very early, the ones until quite recently, the word that's used for doubting, because we'll see in the passage when we read it, if you've already heard the reading, you'll see it says, stop doubting and believe. The Greek actually doesn't use the word doubt. It says, don't be without faith. Don't be without belief. Rather, believe. Don't be without belief. And it's a different kind of process, being without belief. And I think actually, in some ways, Thomas is sort of rescued by this idea of doubting, because I think there is a problem with Thomas. And I think that's why John uses the story of Thomas so powerfully, so importantly within his story. It's one of the great climax moments in this remarkable small book that John pulled together, the Gospel of John. You see, I think Thomas did believe. The problem is, and I think as we're going to see this, he believed in the wrong Jesus, the wrong kind of Jesus. You see, I think Thomas, he believed in what Jesus did. He didn't believe what Jesus said. See, I think there are many people within our churches, many people outside our churches, who do believe in what Jesus did, but they're less willing to believe what Jesus actually said. I mean, Doubting Thomas, I mean, what a name. I have to say, I don't like titles or nicknames or labels, especially when they're applied to me. Most of us can remember the nicknames that we used for them at school. I went to a school in inner city Birmingham for much of my senior schooling, and I have to tell you, I can't mention the nicknames they used for me in polite company. Most nicknames are cruel. They're designed and meant to hurt and mark the individual with the power of the crowd, the mob. In the factories I worked in, on the shop floor, and then later on in the boardrooms even that I worked in, nicknames were also used to summarize people and thereby write them off as having been of one characteristic or one idea or one moment. Politics at its lowest form does precisely the same thing. Trite phrases are used to categorize and label and ultimately dismiss an opponent. I don't want to be prophetic, but I just suggest that you watch the next American presidential election campaign that'll be coming up in the next few months. Just watch how titles and labels are used to dismiss someone without bothering to hear what they actually have to say. That's how nicknames are used. They're very effective at it. And poor old doubting Thomas has quickly become a story of somebody who doubted and dithered. But I think there's more to it. And John put a lot of work into drawing a more clever and nuanced picture of Thomas. These nicknames are designed to sum us up in a single word, and when they stick, people are written off on this basis, that that's what they're like, that's all they're like, that's all they will ever be like. But this is a big mistake. John's careful portrayal shows us somebody actually who changes and how develops. The nickname doubting does him, and does the story of him, no justice at all. But it also, if we just hear that phrase, doubting Thomas, it closes our ears to what John was trying to do. Thomas famously appears 3 times in John's Gospel. Firstly, with Jesus. And it's when Jesus and then the disciples are both hesitating about whether to go and see Lazarus in John chapter 11, the famous story of the resurrection of Lazarus. But there is a large section at the beginning. You've got to wonder why so much time is spent on this debate, this hesitation about whether to go. Jesus says, wait. And the other disciples said, that shouldn't we be going? But just a few days later, I think it's 4 days later, when Lazarus is known to have died, the positions are reversed. Jesus says, now we must go. But the disciples say, hang on, it might be dangerous. There are people that want to kill you. But Thomas it is who breaks through what he sees as this dithering. And then he clearly says to everybody, then Thomas said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. You can actually translate that. Let us just go. Thomas liked certainty. He wanted to see action. He wanted to get on with things. And that kind of certainty is an attractive and a life-giving thing. Certainty moves us on from endless and pointless debates. It provides genuine leadership. In fact, certainty is so alluring that one can follow the certainty of a good leader through thick and thin, even to death in the case of Thomas. Thomas's second appearance in John's Gospel shows a similar need for clarity and certainty. In chapter 14, it's the night before Jesus is betrayed and died. All the disciples are gathered together in that upper room. They've shared that meal that none of them could ever forget. And then Jesus has washed the disciples' feet. And after that drama, that interaction with him, and particularly with Peter, who won't let him wash his feet, Jesus then is talking about what's about to come. And he says, don't worry. Believe in me. Believe in God. I'm going to go, he says, and I'm going to come back. And then I'm going to take you to where I am. And then he says, and it's a phrase that has become precious to us, and I say it at most funerals, if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. And then John, he adds in this, and you know the way to the place where I'm going. Now, he could have just carried on with what Jesus was saying, but John deliberately, he puts in this line, this question, this moment of drama from Thomas. And Thomas says, Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? And of course, Jesus famously answers, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me, he says. He goes on and says, look, if you really know me, then you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. John is emphasizing Thomas's demand for certainty again. Jesus points to himself as the sole reliable source of certainty. You want certainty, Thomas? It's me. You look at me, then you can know God. And then after this debate, in John 14, the whole debate follows. Jesus says, don't you know me? Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. And I have to tell you, that starts to sound vague again. I can almost imagine Thomas rolling his eyes at this kind of vague and uncertain answer. He loves certainty. He wants clarity. So in today's reading, a week later from the resurrection of Jesus, having been separate from all the other disciples on that first evening when Jesus first appeared to them that we looked at last week, this man who wants clarity and certainty, this is what he says: unless I see the nail marks in his hands, put my finger where his nails were, and put my hand into his side, then I will not believe. It's like he's shouting. Unless I can be certain, unless I can see, I will not be part of this. And Jesus has a response in two parts. It says in verse 26, a week later, his disciples were in the house again. This time, Thomas was with them. Even though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them, and he said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand. Put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Well, that experience certainly gave Thomas clarity. Artists since the 5th century, when they've drawn pictures and painted remarkably beautiful paintings of Thomas, in almost all cases, he's touching the wounds, fingering the very wounds in response to Jesus' offer. Although it's interesting, John, he never says whether Thomas actually does touch the wounds of Jesus. And then Thomas says this: "My Lord and my God." The second part of Jesus' response is this. He says to him afterwards, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And this is the key. You see, for John's gospel, this story, this moment, this exclamation of Thomas, "My Lord and my God," and this statement of Jesus, that blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed, this is the end of John's gospel. There's a little summing up in a couple of verses afterwards, which are beautiful in their own right. In fact, there's another chapter, but that's really an epilogue. We're going to look at that next week. But it is clear that John intended this story of Thomas to be the climax of his own version of Jesus' story. Why? Well, it's simple. John's entire gospel is to show not just who was Jesus, but the effect of Jesus on many different people. It's what Jesus does to people's hearts and minds and lives. It's their response, these different characters in John's gospel, their response to Jesus, that is one of the unique elements of his gospel. There are others. Nicodemus, he occurs only in this gospel, but his 3 appearances show a remarkable transformation in him as a person. You can look it up for yourself in chapters 3 and 7 at the end of chapter 20. The woman at the well in chapter 4, she is changed. Her whole story is in one chapter after an encounter with Jesus. The man who's born blind. Chapter 9 is all about that man, how that man is changed. That's the whole of chapter 9. Martha and Mary have a remarkable transformation. Lazarus, of course, has a huge transformation over several passages. We also see that Peter is changed. John's gospel intentionally has a host of people with prominent roles who are changed. They change their minds, they change their attitudes about life. So no wonder that the verses that follow this story of Thomas. You can see it for yourself in your own Bibles. He says Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, it says. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So Thomas's nickname is wrong. He was not so much a doubter, he was a believer. But he just believed in the wrong Jesus. He liked what Jesus had done. I'm not sure he'd really listened to what Jesus had been saying. He was a believer. I think Jesus felt the same way. When Jesus chose him as a disciple, Thomas was clearly close, confident with Jesus even. He had the ear of the disciples. And John, the gospel writer, remembered things that Thomas had said a long time afterwards. The Catholic Church has long had a tremendous respect for Thomas, who is credited with traveling to India and establishing the very powerful church in South India. Kerala, the southern state in India, is a Christian state in the middle of a whole Hindu and Islamic world. And Thomas, of course, is held to have been martyred doing that. The story of Thomas, believing Thomas, is someone who grows in his faith. And he's therefore presented by John as an example, a case study in what it can mean for many Christians, how they grow, change, develop in their relationship, their understanding, their confidence in what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. Thomas's is a journey that many Christians take, and some still need to take, but one that all of us will benefit from. Let's see where Thomas began and where he finishes to see if we can spot his journey. So at the beginning, Thomas believed what Thomas saw. He didn't believe what Jesus said. It looks to me that Thomas, like the disciples, they liked Jesus a lot at the beginning. They liked his ability to handle crowds, his willingness to be an affront to corrupt authority. Thomas would have liked Jesus' clear stand on moral issues, cutting through the politics in the religious establishment. I think Thomas was one of those that would have thought that Jesus was the kind of man that was needed, and he therefore would have loved the evidence that he was a man of power and unique ability. Thomas would have loved the miracles, loved the passion for people. He would have loved that level of commitment that Jesus engendered in people. And I suspected he even would have liked Jesus' management style, firm, very mentoring and developing, caring, but never wavering from standards, never wavering from the purpose. So it's no surprise that he would declare that he would follow him anywhere. It's no surprise in the first of those three accounts of Thomas, he says, come on, let's go and die with him. It seems to me that he's saying, if he's worth living for, he's worth dying for. But the thing is, I don't think Thomas understood some of the things that Jesus was saying. He ignored the occasions when Jesus pointed out that he was going to have to suffer and rise again from the dead. So Thomas, well, he stuck with the bits that he liked. He just kept going back over the things that were exciting. I'm sure he told the stories of the great miracles, those great moments in Jesus' ministry. He went back over and over again. He didn't like the difficult stuff. He never really engaged with the claims of Jesus. That's why I'm not surprised that the second time we see him in that room of such passion and drama that night before Jesus died, when Jesus talks about being one with the Father and going and leaving them and rising again, and to Thomas says, well, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? He saw what Jesus did, and Thomas, I think, believed that he could do it again. He believed in what he saw. He believed in what he knew. But he hadn't yet come to believe in all that Jesus had said. He especially didn't seem to believe or understand what Jesus said about himself. I mean, the disciples often had trouble with that. Peter tried to stop Jesus talking about his death. Jesus told them several times about his death and rising again, but they all refused to listen to him. That stuff Thomas could not be certain of. Better stick with what we know. And most of us do that, especially with things about God. Stick to the stuff you know. I'll tell you what Thomas did know. They all knew, actually, at that time. They knew the Romans were in charge. Oh, they knew that. They understood power. It was a society based on power and violence. They knew that it was very difficult and dangerous to rebel or even speak up against the Jewish temple authorities, and almost impossible to speak up against the Roman authorities. He was certain of power and violence. Certainly knew the certainty of a Roman death by public crucifixion. There was plenty of clarity there. So when Thomas demands that God shows him, he specifies the evidence that he understands, the evidence that impresses him with its power, and shows Thomas where he believes true power is. So he says, show me the wounds. So Jesus comes, shows him the wounds. He doesn't show him a healed body. He shows him real wounds, but wounds that now they no longer have the power. They don't have the power to kill. They don't even have the power to damage Jesus. He didn't appear to Thomas with no wound. He showed him them. Wounds like this don't determine life and death anymore. And Jesus, by doing that, shows him. Now Thomas can believe, not just in what he has seen in the past, but now he can believe in what Jesus had been saying about coming back, about a life, a new kind of life, a new kind of power. Our churches have plenty of people who are attracted to the idea of Jesus. Certainly the modern idea of a warm and comforting and welcoming and forgiving figure of faith. He is indeed, that warm, welcoming figure, something we can believe in. And it is a great place to start. I think Thomas started there. His desire for certainty, for hope, and something better, well, that drew him to Jesus Christ. But there are even more of us who are a part of church because of what Jesus does for us today. People love the idea of what he did in the past, and people do like the idea of what God has done in some churches, especially in our past. Our churches, quite rightly, are supposed to be loving and safe communities with shared values and clear purposes. Churches have been used again and again to transform places, and I've seen that done wonderfully, always imperfectly. But there is a tendency for us to keep going back to what the church has done. And an emphasis and a stress about what the church should be doing. We can very easily become obsessed, not just in what Jesus did in the Bible, but what Jesus is doing today and has done in the past. I mean, these things are good. They're very good. But let me tell you this, that the story of Thomas says that life, real life, comes when we believe not just in what he has done, and he has done these things, and he can do them again. But life comes when you believe not to be done, but by believing in what he says about himself, about what he said about himself then and what he is still saying today. He has far more for us in the future than he has done in the past. We lose heart so quickly. It's like we have lost the faith in the Jesus who said these things. We can trust what he's done, but we fail to trust what he says. But when Jesus came across Thomas, when Jesus stood there in front of him and showed him that these wounds no longer kill, no longer damage. Thomas changed, and he changed right there in front of all the other disciples. John never forgot that moment. He had to not only include it in his book of memories, it was the great climax. It's the great moment in John's gospel. My Lord and my God. My Lord, a common phrase, but my God. Well, Thomas is the first to use it. I don't think he was the first to believe it. John said just earlier on in chapter 20, he says, do you remember this from Easter morning? It says this, the other disciple who reached the tomb first, he went in after Peter. And he looked and he saw the empty tomb. And it says this, he saw and believed. And it's like John saw and believed but didn't dare say anything. But then a week later, when Thomas who had demanded certainty and demanded evidence, right in front of John, this man who wanted clarity and certainty was given precisely that by Jesus. So John writes and remembers his entire book leading up to that moment, my Lord and my God, where Thomas is remembered saying by John that remarkable phrase. Watching the penny drop, watching his heart melting, and watching his fire burning. So, in the end, you see, Thomas finally believed what Jesus said. And from then on, of course, he no longer needed to see Jesus in order to believe. And I want to make a suggestion to us all today that actually we should be more like Thomas at the end of the story. Our faith is often based on what we have seen and what we know, and that's okay. Everybody starts that way. But Jesus calls us to something bigger, something better, more courageous, to believe not just what he's done, believe more than what he is doing, but believe what he said, believe what he is saying. Let your faith, let our lives be shaped, not so much on clinging onto the hope that Jesus might repeat something he's done in the past, that he might perform some miracle in our lives if we go to church enough or pray hard enough. Let me tell you, he does good things in our lives because he loves us. No, instead, the story for today from Thomas is let our lives, our thoughts, our feelings, our hopes, our fears, all these things, let them be shaped by who he said he was, and therefore by what he is capable of. He will give us peace when we listen to what he says about freedom, when we know and live out his truth. He will give us life when we follow his teachings and when we become the new creations. He gives you and me an undefeatable hope, joy, love, and peace when we realize how shallow our society's values are, like Jesus said. And also, if we believe him and what he said, how easily, how freely available his new kingdom, his new society is. And then we can allow these things to be a new certainty in our lives. We can be certain not just of what he did, but what he says. Even when we don't feel it, we can be certain of it. For we know it is coming. All these good things are coming with a flawless and assured promise. The only thing I would doubt is that Jesus will actually do what we expect him to. That he'll just repeat again what he's done in the past. I would doubt he's going to do that. Why don't you realize and believe that he wants to do more? More in your family, more in your heart, more in our church, more in tomorrow. And then we will say with our hearts, my Lord and my God. Jesus put it like this: because you have seen me, you have believed. Truly blessed are those who have not seen, but have believed. Let me pray. Father, you have done wonderful things in our lives. You have healed us, mended our broken hearts. You have held on to us, given us something that we can be sure of in the past. But we pray, Father, that our faith will not depend on those things, but will depend on knowing you and meeting you today, so that our courage and confidence may grow because of the promises that you have made. Don't let the past hold on to us. Instead, Father, take us forward into something fresh and new and vibrant. And we thank you that you came back from the dead to show us this, to convince us of this, and to make us certain of this. Amen. Amen. God bless.